It's April 5th, 1971. American table tennis player Glenn Cowan's heart races as he navigates the crowded streets of Nagoya, Japan. At 19, Cowan is a shy, long-haired kid from California who earned his spot on the U.S. national team through junior victories and a passion for ping pong. In America, table tennis isn't exactly a path to fame, and Cowan isn't a household name. But that only fuels his drive to prove himself on the international stage. Now, at the World Table Tennis Championships in Japan, he's set to face the world's best players. In this moment, though, it's not about winning. It's about catching the bus. He's running late, and missing this ride means scrambling to find another way to the competition. Up ahead, there's a bus on the curb. What happens next depends on who's telling the story. According to the Chinese, Cowan stumbles up the steps as the doors are closing and the bus takes off. It's only then that he realizes he's the lone American on a shuttle meant for the Chinese table tennis team. But Cowan remembers it differently. He would later say that he was invited to board the Chinese bus with the team, which obviously shocked him. Both accounts agree on the tension of the moment. As Cowan settles into his seat, there's an awkward silence. For more than 20 years, official contact between the U.S. and China has been limited to indirect conflict and icy hostility fueled by Cold War tension. But eventually, the ice begins to thaw. Cowan starts speaking to the players through their English interpreter. Zhuang Zedong, a three-time world champion and one of China's star players, rises from his seat and approaches the American athlete. With a smile, he extends his hand, presenting Cowan with a silkscreen print of a Chinese mountain, a gift and a gesture of goodwill. Cowan, caught off guard, rummages through his bag in search of something to reciprocate, but all he can find is a comb. The next day, he comes prepared, gifting Zhuang a t-shirt. On it, an American flag, a peace symbol, and the Beatles' lyrics, "Let It Be." Soon after, the People's Republic of China officially invites the American table tennis team to visit China. Hey everyone, it's Kavitha Davidson, and welcome back to Sportly, where we uncover the stories behind the headlines and the moments when sports changed the world. To kick off 2025, we're launching a two-part series on the intersection of sports and global politics. This week, we'll dive into the history and potential of sports diplomacy. And next week, we'll examine the darker side, sports washing. Sports have a unique ability to bring people together, whether it's fans, neighbors, or communities. So why not entire nations? The scene we began with marked a pivotal moment in what's known as ping pong diplomacy, an exchange that played a key role in thawing diplomatic relations between the U.S. and China. Today, while the U.S. and China are far from harmonious, especially on human rights issues, they remain critical trade partners despite ongoing sanctions and trade embargoes. Since 1949, the two countries have experienced cycles of tension and cooperation on issues from tech to climate change and, of course, Taiwan. While we won't even attempt to cover 70 plus years of history in this episode, here's a bit of context. For nearly 30 years, communications between the U.S. and China was limited, mostly to proxy wars in East Asia. During the Korean War in the 1950s, the U.S. supported South Korea while China backed North Korea. The same dynamic repeated in Vietnam, with the U.S. supporting the South and China, along with the Soviet Union, backing the North. During this period, the U.S. also formally recognized and backed Taiwan, then known as the Republic of China, as the legitimate government of China, rather than the People's Republic of China. It was against this political backdrop, amid Cold War tensions, that Glenn Cowan boarded the Chinese team's bus and ping pong diplomacy emerged. In this episode, we're exploring the captivating story of the American table tennis team's historic visit to China, an event that played a pivotal role in reshaping international relations. We'll also dive into some other key moments of sports diplomacy, including the 1964 Tokyo Olympics and how baseball became a bridge between Cuba and the United States. We'll be exploring these questions. How are sports used by political powers to foster international relations, advance agendas, and act as a tool for establishing a nation's global image? And why has the soft power of sports been so effective in breaking through decades of political conflict? It's April 10th, 1971, a few days after Glenn Cowan's encounter with the Chinese table tennis team. The U.S. national team flies to Hong Kong and crosses the Lo-Wu border, the first official American delegation to visit China since 1949. The team visits Beijing, Shanghai, and Tianjin, playing exhibition matches against the Chinese national team and visiting sites like the Great Wall. One player, Judy Horfrost, who was 15 years old at the time of the visit, recounts her experience as an adult.
I did not speak directly with the players. They didn't speak English. We had interpreters, but we didn't have long philosophical conversations. It was more like about table tennis, and it was more very brief and that kind of thing. But we did have really good conversations with the interpreters. When we drove on the bus to the Great Wall, that was a nice long drive, and we would talk, and we had lots of questions, and they answered, gave us kind of their ideas of, why is China going to have these certain philosophies.
For the Americans, it's as much a cultural exchange as a sports competition. As Horfrost mentions, the slogan was friendship first, competition second. After the matches, the U.S. team travels to the Great Hall of the People, where they shake hands with Zhou Enlai, the foreign minister and premier of China. Zhou greets each player with a firm handshake and expresses gratitude for the spirit of competition. It's clear, this visit is about much more than just ping pong. It's diplomacy in action. The 10-day trip is heavily covered in the press, with headlines like, U.S. team crosses into China, and not with a bang, but a ping. Later, President Richard Nixon meets with USA table tennis president Graham Steenhoven at the White House. This is Steenhoven commenting on Zhou Enlai and whether Nixon would approve a possible visit by the Chinese team.
Well, all I can say to you is that the president certainly will cooperate in this venture in any way that he can to make it as meaningful and as friendly as possible. I'm positive of that.
Less than a year later, in 1972, President Nixon becomes the first U.S. president ever to visit China. His trip, later dubbed the week that changed the world, marks a turning point in U.S. China relations. After the trip, both governments issue the Shanghai Communique, in which the United States declares its support for one China, meaning it does not support Taiwanese independence. The document provides the basis for the formal normalization of U.S. China relations under the Carter administration. On December 15, 1978, President Jimmy Carter gives a speech on establishing formal relations with China and reducing conflict.
The United States of America and the People's Republic of China have agreed to recognize each other and to establish diplomatic relations as of January the 1st, 1979, and emphasize once again that both sides wish to reduce the danger of international military conflict. The government of the United States of America acknowledges the Chinese position that there is but one China, and Taiwan is part of China.
While ping pong diplomacy remains one of the most iconic examples of sports being used to improve and soften international relations, it's far from the only instance. In 1964, the Olympics are held in Tokyo, Japan, marking the first time an Asian country hosts the Games. Hosting the games isn't just about showcasing athletic excellence. It's largely about reshaping Japan's image after the devastating impact of World War II nearly 2 decades earlier. A powerful symbol of this shift is the selection of Yoshinori Sakai, the torchbearer for the opening ceremony. Born in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, the day the atomic bomb was dropped, Sakai embodies the country's recovery and its path toward rebuilding and reconciliation. Ahead of the Games, Japan focuses on modernizing its infrastructure in preparation for international visitors.
The basic elements of the Japanese garden, rocks and water, are also applied in modern architectural design.
The Olympics spur the creation of groundbreaking projects, such as the Shinkansen bullet train, upgraded highways, and even a satellite that allows the first live global broadcast of the event. On the athletic front, Japan's delegation is nearly double the size of the one sent to the Rome Olympics 4 years earlier. They end the Games with 29 medals, trailing only the United States and the Soviet Union in total medal count. This strong athletic performance, combined with the pretty flawless execution of the Games, helps redefine Japan's role on the global stage.
Here comes Speed Racer, he's a demon on wheels.
Rather than attempting to erase the scars of the past, Japan strategically leverages the power of sports to reintroduce itself to the world, beginning a cultural exchange of food, modern technology, and pop culture to the West. Another example of sports diplomacy? Baseball. Baseball has become deeply embedded in both American and Cuban cultures, creating a shared space for connection despite the country's tense relations. American baseball players begin visiting Cuba all the way back at the turn of the century. For decades, Negro League teams face teams of Cuban All-Stars, and eventually, many of these Cuban players come to America to join the Negro Leagues as the New York Cubans. After the Cuban Revolution in 1959 and the subsequent severing of diplomatic ties between the U.S. and Cuba, the sport remains a symbol of their common history. In the decades after the revolution, Cuban players go through great lengths to defect to America and play in Major League Baseball.
A handful have made a perilous escape from Castro's oppressive regime to glory in the majors.
In the 1990s, the Clinton administration recognizes the potential for baseball to establish people-to-people contacts between the United States and Cuba. It's March 28, 1999, and the Baltimore Orioles are facing off against Cuba's national baseball team at Estadio Latinoamericano in Havana. It's the first time in 40 years that an MLB team has played in Cuba. For the past few decades, it's been complicated, to say the least.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
Of course, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, economic embargoes, and travel restrictions enforced by the 1992 Cuban Democracy Act and the 1996 Helms-Burton Act. Despite opposition from several members of the House of Representatives, Orioles owner Peter Angelos manages to secure permission from the White House to travel to Cuba for baseball, of all things. On the mound, pitching for Cuba, is future major leaguer Jose Contreras, who would later go on to win the World Series with the Chicago White Sox in 2005. Throughout the game, sports commentators John Miller and Joe Morgan broadcast to an American audience watching at home.
55,000 close personal friends of Fidel. It's invitation only today at Latino Americano Stadium, and they're all here.
It's a close game heading into extra innings. In the 11th inning, Baltimore's Harold Baines drives Will Clark home, and the Orioles win 3-2. Now, to be sure, no direct policy changes come after this game, but it does at least signal to the world that the U.S. and Cuba could get along, and that we have something in common in the game of baseball. 17 years later, President Barack Obama revisits this practice of baseball diplomacy. In 2016, he and the First family attend an exhibition game in Havana between the Tampa Bay Rays and the Cuban national baseball team.
Obama took in the game sitting next to Cuban President Raul Castro, and if there's one thing the two countries can agree on, it's their love of baseball.
It's the first time an MLB team has played in Cuba since the Orioles in 1999, and Obama is the first sitting U.S. president to visit Havana since Calvin Coolidge did 88 years earlier. It's an historic moment, and not just for its symbolic importance or demonstration of growing goodwill between the countries. You see, a week before, Obama had announced that he was easing travel restrictions and lifting the ban on American companies employing Cuban nationals. The implications of this policy shift are wide-ranging. For baseball, it means that MLB could recruit and sign Cuban players without them defecting, which is obviously a boon to their business. Now, President Donald Trump would soon reverse those changes, and U.S. Cuba relations continue to fluctuate. But that baseball game in 2016 showed that reconciliation is actually possible. As Obama's Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, said at the time, baseball is a great example of the cultural ties between the United States and Cuba, and a powerful reminder of the shared experience between people that transcends our difficult history. An American ping pong player sitting next to a Chinese player on a bus. Japan reintroducing itself to the world at the Olympics. Major League Baseball teams playing baseball in Cuba. These moments show us that sports act as a mirror of global politics, a tool for connection, and at times, a stage for change. Sports often serve as a visible facade while masking the complex political agendas taking place behind the scenes. But even in these supposed cases of diplomacy, they're almost always about money, about both leagues and countries benefiting from the cultural exchange of the product of sports. And sometimes, they're less about diplomacy and more about distraction. So next week, we'll dig deeper into the flip side of sports diplomacy, sports washing. How do nations use sports to whitewash human rights abuses or distract from political scandals? Until then, thanks for listening to Sportly. Sportly is an Immigrantly media production. This episode was produced by Savia Khan and Shay Yu, written by Jonathan Hazel, Shay Yu, and me, Kavitha Davidson. Our sound designer and editor is Paroma Chakravarti. Our theme music was created by Simon Hutchinson. Other music by Epidemic Sound. Tune back in next week for more Sportly.